Well, good afternoon, everybody. Great pleasure to see lots of people in the theatre today, and I know we've got a huge online audience, as you might expect, for an innovative area of research and how we, as a university, pioneer digital communication. So fantastic to see you. Every year, the Vice-Chancellor, I should say who I am first. I'm Kevin Shakespeare. I'm the Pro Vice-Chancellor for Research and Innovation here at the OU, and chairing our inaugurals is one of the real pleasures of the role. Inaugural lectures are an important part of our academic community, and actually I think they've been enhanced post-COVID by the fact that everyone's embraced attending online as well as in person. So I think we get some fantastic audiences and some really stimulating discussions after the inaugural. They're invited by the Vice-Chancellor, so our professors, to give these presentations, and they aim to give an overview of someone's career to date and also to stimulate thinking about the future of a research field. So in a second, Professor Anne Adams is going to give her inaugural, and we're going to encourage online and social media activity during the presentation. I think we should have a Twitter hashtag at the bottom there. If you are tweeting about the talk, just use the hashtag OU Talks. There's also going to be an online networking opportunity. So after Anne's presentation, those of us that are here today in the Beryl Lecture Theatre can go down and have physical refreshments, but there'll also be an online aspect to that. Do we have a QR code? Are we showing that now or later on for the... Later on. Later on we're going to flash up a QR code, and if you are online you can zap that and it will invite you into a social space, so that even if you're not here today you can still enjoy the networking opportunities. So I hope you really enjoy the talk today. Anne is, as many people will know, a pioneer and a very important part of our Institute for Educational Technology. We'll hear today about her approach to engaged practice, deep learning, all looking at how we improve education, not just for the OU students, but also improving the approaches to higher education across the world, as well as being a very valued member of the IET family here, and since earlier in this year has been working as an academic fellow at the UK Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology, and again reminding us that so many of our academics play these external roles, and encouraging that communication between what happens within universities and the broader community. So on that note, I will invite Anne and say we're very much looking forward to seeing your inaugural, and welcome everybody again to this special event. Over to you, Anne.
So I hope you were all listening to Kevin, but I suspect you weren't. I have a good idea to turn you into a frog. But then, I'm not in a pantomime, and although I'm on a stage, you have assumptions about what an inaugural lecture is about, so I'll be talking to you about why learners, politicians, practitioners and users are not the enemy, and how to listen to them rather than singing and dancing. Yes, a relief there. So, I did actually start my career in acting a long time ago. You can see him at the front there in an Italian straw hat, with behind me Dougie Henshaw of Shetland fame and other TV and films. And actually I left acting to go into a career in academia because of a frustration, because when I was resting, I was doing a lot of market research, and I got very frustrated by the lack of systematic approach to research. So that's what led me into starting in psychology and computing. But I did do a lot of listening to actors, settings, plots, which translated to my understanding in academia and research of listening to people, voices, contexts, and needs. And that is what I'm going to focus on today. Assumptions that we can make in different contexts different places, our awareness of contexts, and our needs in contexts. Different voices, and through that I'm going to look at organisational status and cultures and experiences, both the assumptions, how we can listen to people and organisations, how we can map our understanding, and how that then feeds into outcomes. Now, a lot of my work has focused on technology within these settings, and often it's because it breaches the assumptions that we have. So there's some nice, interesting examples I'm going to give you about some of those breaching of assumptions. So I'm going to give you over 27 years of projects. I'm just skimming over the surface. If you want to know more, and there's lots of projects I haven't talked about, then please come back to me. So first of all, a little humorous introduction to learning and an assumption of what is good. Please don't take this as real. It's just a humorous.
This story is from an article in the bi-monthly American satirical science magazine, The Annals of Improbable Research, which is edited by Mark Abrahams. I should point out that it's unlikely to be true. When, if ever, does a person stop learning? Stephen Rushen, an educationalist based at Penn State University in the United States, says he conducted an experiment to find out. To an early morning introductory economics class of 30 live students, he added 15 dead students, and then observed what happened. After a full semester of study, these were his findings. Attendance. On average, dead students are less likely to skip class than living students, especially on nice warm days. Dead students had perfect attendance, were always in class early, and never left early, unlike their living companions. Behaviour. Dead students were less disruptive than living students. They were less likely to interrupt the teacher, be disrespectful, make noise, or ask irrelevant questions. Class participation. There was no discernible difference between living and dead students' performances in class discussions, responses to questions from the teacher, or when called to the board to solve a problem. Exam performance. This seemed to be the weakest area for the dead students. On average, their scores were 30 to 40 points below the class average. Rushen concluded that dead students definitely have a place in the classroom. Their perfect attendance and exemplary behaviour clearly illustrates their desire to learn. In 3 of the areas I measured, they were at least the equal of, if not superior to, their living peers.
So I think that's a nice humorous introduction to assumptions that we can have, but it does highlight some interesting things about what we think good learning is. So moving on to our assumptions about different contexts of places and our awareness of that context and the needs that we have in that context. So the first example I'm going to give you is from a project that was funded around 2009 of learning out there and in here. So it was between school and adult learners, geologists and historians, and we worked with Microsoft on this. And it was out in the field, connected real-time at the same time to people who were in the classroom in a mission control NASA type approach. And the assumption that we had that I'm going to highlight for each of these projects is that actually when you're in each of these places, that the focus is pretty much the same. It's kind of a premise of distance learning. We listened to those different places and learning at the same time, mapped the different places at the same time, and found an outcome of deep learning through that collaboration at the same time. What we found, though, was that the awareness of time moved at very different places. In the field, it was very quick-paced, it was very relevant to what was going on, and very engaging. In the classroom, in the mission control, it was very reflective, using the evidence, reflecting on that and understanding how to use the evidence and working the task together. Together, they actually engaged in a very exciting way to share their understanding and identify new understandings. So the geologist identified that the Ordnance Survey map was wrong, and we fed that back to the Ordnance Survey. The historians identified in Cambridge a new historical site that they hadn't seen before. So there was a real identification of new understandings through working together. So moving on from places, and this fed into other projects like MASI and other research projects. Moving on from places to our awareness of context and to work that was at the beginning of 2000 and our understanding of privacy and privacy awareness. Now, this was around multimedia communications, but it was way before Zoom or FaceTime or Teams or any of those sort of multimedia communications activities. And the assumption we identified is that people think that they're safe. They don't go in thinking about, oh, is this going to be safe and my privacy going to be invaded? They consider that they're going to be safe in a situation. We listened to their experiences, mapped their contextual understanding, and developed a privacy model, which actually fed into some work here in the social work domain on understanding privacy. So I'm going to give you two examples of this. We've got a multitude of examples, but I'm just going to give you two. The first one was at a conference, an internet standards conference, and the cameras were facing and publicising over the internet the speaker. And we had the assumption, if you're in the audience, that it's just looking at me. But what the cameramen at the time did, obviously they'd watched too many documentaries, they decided to pan the audience, to circle, to give a feel of the buzz. Unfortunately, this is an internet standards conference and most of the audience were asleep. And this got broadcast, and when we interviewed the actual attendees, they'd gone back to their bosses, who were very angry that they'd sent them halfway around the world to a conference to fall asleep. They breached unintentionally. The cameramen hadn't meant to breach privacy, but they breached their privacy. Now, in the model, you can see that actually it's because the information usage had changed. It wasn't what we were all expecting the cameras to do, and the cameramen hadn't thought about how it would be received. I'm going to give you a second example that relates back to this, which is around a department store that uses CCTV cameras. Now, this is a department store it's a national one that we all go into, and we assume when we go into a department store that the CCTV cameras are going to be looked at by security. And it's going to be for security purposes. And because we're not criminals, hopefully none of us are criminals, and we're not stealing things, then we don't really think that it's that sensitive. But what this department store decided to do, and they weren't meaning to invade anybody's privacy, was that they used these CCTV cameras, the managers, to assess the performance management of their staff without them knowing it. And so therefore they had different people looking at the information, managers, for performance management, which then changed the sensitivity of the information and completely caused an uproar. So we need to understand when we're deploying technology how it's going to be received in context and our awareness of different contexts. And we need to listen to that. So now moving on from privacy awareness to educational needs. Now, this is a project called JuxtaLearn, and we have a lead researcher here today, that was funded in around 2012 onwards. And the assumption here is that deep understanding, if we develop deep understanding in our learners, then they will have better exam success. And to deal with it, we identified through students and teachers what students' barriers to deep understanding were, the concepts that they were finding particularly difficult to understand. And we helped them to understand these tricky topics, which came from the theory of threshold concept, through creative learning. And that was using videos. So the students made little documentaries and videos of these concepts. So something like an equation. the equal sign would be turned into a little character to help communicate to other students. And we mapped the creative learning and produced an understanding of these tricky topics and how it can feed into learning design. I'm going to show you another little video on this. I do apologise, this was filmed a long time ago, so some of the quality is not amazing. And I apologise to my daughter because actually, although it was, the research was across Europe, across schools and universities, a lot of these clips are at a local school that my daughter was at the time.
I did a pencast of the answers, but I verbalised my thought processes and how I approached every question and why I did this and why I thought that and how I did that, and they found that really useful.
Basically, they're like dying, and then they use their titrations. What are we doing? You go with it. Why did you choose that?
Okay, so N is number of moles.
Whoa! You're so big! 44 grams. And I'm 1 mole. You're huge! You're massive! And you're so small. And I'm bigger than you. So I'm 1 mole. And I'm 1 mole. What? We're all 1 mole?
But how did you know? Every move I made.
Your narrative Brechtian method let you down, my apprentice.
No, it's brilliant. It is actually very, very good. I think it was useful for a snapshot view of the group to see how they were particularly weak at gas calculations. You look here, you've got this one student that's pretty weak on all of it, and one student that was pretty strong on those things, so you could pair them up.
Yeah.
It makes me go, actually, maybe that student could try and teach that student, or try and unpack their learning in that way, and then help these ones out as well. So this makes me think they could, the intervention could be with them, but this has to be kind of a bit more me. I have to then go and look at it again and go, actually, what is it about that? It could be me on that one. And possibly be teaching it again would be useful.
One of the students that apparently seemed to make no progress by terms of the quiz, so for that she felt disheartened. But what it did do is I showed her visualise, and she could see that one of the areas that she hadn't made, that she hadn't done well, the big gap, was what she felt out of the entire thing she was strongest on. So she has gone home to bone up on epic theatre. That's what she's realised, that she wasn't as secure as she felt she was, and the quiz has highlighted that, which is, that's priceless, absolutely priceless.
So, what we found from the research across Europe was that this creative learning approach, juxtaposing, did statistically significantly increase deep understanding in a concept area. But unfortunately, going back to that assumption that we had, deep learning equals exam success, a lot of the exams at school level they're not based on deep understanding, they're based on memorization, regurgitation, repetition. So unfortunately, it wasn't actually fulfilling that end of it. However, at university level, depending on the assessment that was employed, it was supporting this deeper understanding, and that resulted in better assessment results. So actually that's led to this policy that we've developed called developing parrots, not problem solvers, that feeding back that the education system needs to really rethink how we're assessing our students. But it's also led to us understanding that that approach of tricky topics and deep understanding can feed into practice, because you need to really understand something if you're going to apply it in a hospital setting, in a police setting. You need to really deeply understand it. So it's been quite useful in that practical learning context, which is now how I move you on to some work that we did in the police sector. So here, the assumption, what we were looking at here was child witness interviewing. So there's a problem, and there's training on child witness interviewing. But the assumption that the training that's made is that actually vulnerability is the same regardless on who you're interviewing. So if it's a dementia patient that's being interviewed or a child that's being interviewed, the same approach is taken, or there was at this time. It's kind of changed a bit now. So we listened to trainers, to police, we looked at the literature on child witness interviewing and fed that into the concepts, the tricky topic concepts that are difficult to understand, and then fed that into a design process. Now, one of the concepts, and my son will like this, having inspired me with regard to gaming, is that it fed into a rapport bar, which you can see up there, so that if the learners were actually following and developing a better rapport, the rapport bar went up. So it gave them immediate feedback on their understanding. But if it didn't, it went down. And this helped give immediate feedback in the simulation, the game training. And so what we found was that when it was evaluated in a randomized controlled trial across police forces across the country, it statistically significantly increased deep understanding, which was very valuable for going out to interview child witnesses. Unfortunately, the face-to-face standard national program at that time, which has changed, statistically significantly decreased their understanding. They got worse at interviewing children after they'd taken the face-to-face training. But it was, to be fair, because the assumption was inaccurate, which is what I'm trying to talk you through. You really need to understand if those assumptions are accurate and appropriate. And for contextual needs, it wasn't. So now moving on from context to different voices. I'm going to be talking about organizational status and cultures, moving into clinical settings work that I've done and working that a PhD student, Anne Pike, did in prisons, and also in academia and working with librarians. And understanding the cultures and different experiences, moving into the more recent work that I'm doing at the moment. First of all, talking about voices and status, I'm going to talk about some digital library work that was done about 2003 to 2010. And this was in a clinical setting, deploying digital libraries in hospitals and in an educational setting, and the role of librarians in that role and that connection, and also in prisons, information and learning that occurred in prisons. And the assumption is that knowledge is power. The higher status you are, the higher power you have, then you should have more access to knowledge. And this is the tradition in a lot of organizations. And we listen to practitioners, their barriers, what enabled them to learn on the job in what we call evidence-based practice. And we looked at the digital information context and the role of intermediaries like librarians and different types of intermediaries that can facilitate learning on the job. And what we found was that the standard approach is that status is traditionally giving the higher information. So nursing managers would say, oh, junior nurses, they just have the standard text. And a consultant would say, well, I'm a consultant, so I get the journals. And a prison officer would say, well, I don't understand, we don't get training, why are the prisoners getting learning? And in academia, academics would say, well, you know, the librarians don't really understand the teaching process or what it is to understand our topic area. There are these status structures across all of this. And that got rationalized, as one surgeon said, well, they will misunderstand the national guidelines. So I think for junior doctors, they can be misleading, harmful, damaging. These are standard guidelines that everybody, even the public, are supposed to have access to. But this is a rationalization of why they should have access to them. And in fact, the surgeon went on to say, we should be metering and synthesizing and understanding it for those junior doctors. But it also led on to perceptions about what evidence-based practice is, learning on the job, using digital libraries in practice. They said it's just playing. It's not really learning. It's learning is doing the nursing, is doing the doctoring, is doing your time as a prisoner. This is just playing. And why are we wasting time on this? They didn't understand the connection to a more effective practice. But it was also a fear of change. So before, their status had given them access to the high-level learning. Now, technology was coming in. And it wasn't them being higher level, it was their skills in using the technologies, in using the digital libraries. But they were also scared of that technology. As one consultant said, it's like being given a Rolls Royce and only being able to sound the horn. It's that frustration, I can't use it. It looks good, but I can't use it. But you'd say, well, they just need to have training. But there was a fear of looking stupid, less expert amongst their junior employees. In fact, as one librarian said, the academics come and hide at the back of the classroom with the students, pretending they're looking after them, to write notes and learn themselves. That's that lack of understanding. So moving on from status in digital libraries and in academia and clinical settings to status in the police. So in this project, which started around 2017, we looked at the idea of sharing. And in the police culture, although there's a deep motive to share, they really do want to share, there's a hierarchical, competitive culture between different police forces. So sharing between police forces can be a bit negative, and sharing amongst themselves could be a bit negative perceived. As the detective inspector said, I think there's not a great sharing culture in the police. So we listened to different status levels, we mapped sharing barriers, and fed back recommendations to the Home Office, and some of those have been taken up by the College of Policing. And the report is accessible to everybody. And what we identified is that they talked again about we don't have time to share. We've got high workloads, demanding roles. They didn't see the relationship between sharing and doing their job more effectively. They were reluctant also to share failures. They didn't mind sharing them verbally, but they had a problem about writing it down. Ironically, the police are using a lot of social media and tweeting, and they didn't mind tweeting about things, but they did mind, like I said, about writing it down. And they didn't know how to effectively share. So we put in place evidence cafes that stripped away the status and looked at different types of evidence, experiences, as well as research literature, as well as processes and procedures, and helped map those together. I'm going to give you one example of a problem of sharing, which comes back to a police officer who was learning while he was on the job, evidence-based practice, and he was doing a master's. So there's been a huge push in the police to move into a clinical model of having higher level learning in the workplace. And he was talking about on Twitter a standard problem that we'd hear about at the OU all the time, about managing his work life, his home life, and his learning. And he was talking about needing me time and how to find references and having problems in finding references. And he tweeted about this. This would be pretty common at the OU, tweeting about that demanding challenge. And the response he got from another cop was this: "Can you remember when you stopped being a cop? This academic bleep is annoying cops on the front line. I can't believe you can't see it. Me time. Cops don't get refs. You symbolise everything that cops resent. Get real, relevant and appropriate and enter the conversation." So this is obviously an intelligent person, but they're so emotionally negative to this shift in culture within the police force, and shift in cultures that are happening in lots of organisations and keep happening as technology moves things on and cultures change. So moving on to another culture, a security culture. that we all experience with passwords, and every organisation has a very similar security culture. So we assume that passwords and the problems with passwords is memorability. We can't remember them all. But actually, when we listen to security departments and users, there was an underpinning issue of the approach of security, which comes from a military background of a need to know and the enemy within, and that we are all enemies, potential enemies within the organisation. So the approach of security is to restrict the information you have, to actually make it less usable, because you could use that usability against us. So we've argued for security ownership, that like quality control, which comes down to the individual to be responsible for, that actually security should come down to departments to be able to manage. Does this need, what's the level of security? How are we managing it? And that has been a bit of, and it still is a bit contentious with security that has that status, power, control. Although there's some moves in America from security experts towards humanized security. I'm going to give you two examples of two organizations that had security, had reflections on security in their organizational structure. So the first one actually had a very low security. People talked about the fact you could get in there with a Blockbuster card. That shows you how old this project is. And that led them to think, well, actually, then, nothing we do here is very important. Everything's pretty easy, you know, it doesn't really matter. And actually, I need to get on with my job, work as a team, when I'm on holiday, be able to allow people to do things. And so they ended up putting Post-it notes on their computers, sharing their passwords, allowing everybody to have access to the system. The other organisation was a telecommunications, a famous telecommunications company, which had extremely high security. You had different levels you had to go through. You had to do key things, cards to get in. It was high security. That led the people who worked there to believe, well, then we're safe. We get through the gates and we're all safe. Everything's perfectly fine. And I need to get on with my job and work in a team. And when I'm on holiday, I can't get on with my job with the security that's there. So they ended up putting Post-it notes on their computers, sharing their passwords. This finding really freaked out the security departments and still does, because it's an argument for having ownership of security, them understanding threats, not just being forced into it because they'll just circumvent, but actually relating and owning it. So another culture that I'm going to coming to the end of this talk about is policy culture. So the assumption here, a current project that I'm working on at Westminster, is around expertise and consensus. So on this project, we're looking at the future topics, horizon scanning for future topics. Now, often that's been identified by horizon experts and people who understand policy making, and we're moving them into a wider academic research and national program of identifying topics. Listening to experts and policymakers and mapping this policy-led interest to topics and developing a new Delphi 2 model. And using that with the Inquire platform that was developed at the OU with BBC for Garden Watch and to citizen science engagement. So it's moving towards a wider engagement in identifying these topics. So also, this is fed into the last area that I'm going to talk about, two projects here. This one about professional development across the world, in Africa and back to the UK. And again, the identification that knowledge is power, that we need to listen to different practice needs and come back to that context, and policymakers. And again, using evidence cafes. But again, it's that status, again, that knowledge is power. So we've used that evidence cafes to equitably divide and understand different experiences in context. Finally, a project on diversity with apprentices at the OU. And this was apprentices in nursing and social work. Now, the assumption here is around stereotypes when we're looking at diversity. So somebody like my mother-in-law here would be associated as being older. So then there's an assumption made about her needs rather than understanding her lifetime of experiences and current experiences. And maybe ethnicity or gender, I'm not saying that these aren't important issues, but we need to understand the experiences and map those. And beyond that, actually value the diversity of experiences. We all have an amazing history of experiences that should be valued by organisations and society, that can feed into and support us understanding and valuing the complexity rather than putting people in pigeonholes. And that's led us towards a diversity capital framework that I'm working with colleagues like Chris Kubiak to develop. Because ultimately, we need to listen to all of your experiences, all of our experiences. We all move between different worlds. So my mother-in-law, Jane, has had lots of experiences, and she moves between different worlds, as we all do. And that can be thought of as insightful. As we move from one social world to another, we take our ideas and experiences with us, and that can be thought of as a great idea. But going back to that status thing, it can also be thought of, but as Haraway says, as deviant, as monstrous. That's not the way we do it here. And that can actually highlight, as Jones has highlighted, that actually passions underpin a lot of what we're looking at. That people can have fears about change, that they can be driven by their desires of status. Understanding and listening to those contextual norms help us to understand when we're changing them or moving them forwards. But listening needs to go both ways. We need to listen to each other and understand and co-create understanding, as Professor Holliman talks about, and Scallon and Dr. Grand. We ultimately, though, need to listen to ourselves and our own needs and reflect on those as well, especially as researchers. Thank you all for listening to my inaugural lecture.
Great, thank you, Anne, so much for outstanding work and a really accessible lecture. So we've got a bit of time for questions, if you don't mind.
Yes, yeah.
We've got the audience here. If you pop your hand up, we've got roving mics that will appear, and we've possibly got some online questions, and Elaine will let us know if anything comes through on that. So whilst you're just having a think about the first questions. Oh, I was going to ask one first, then I'll come in. That's okay, we've clocked it. So a lot of us at the OU have got a real passion for lifelong learning. And I was thinking during your talk that when you're doing lifelong learning and you're looking at group activities, you're going to have people with very different experiences of life learning together, and therefore you're going to have to personalise the approach, and that's quite a difficult thing to do, but also perhaps a very rewarding thing if we get it right. So I just wondered if you could just sort of reflect on the future where we may have very diverse groups of people trying to learn together.
Yeah, and I think that approach, thank you, Kevin, that was an interesting perspective, but those different personalised journeys and experiences can enrich, because actually it helps people see things from a different perspective. So, and it's valuable for yourself to reflect on how something is different. And then especially if you're doing practice-based learning, so you're going into a practical context, you need to be able to listen to different people that you're going to be working with in your employment. So it's a skill in itself to learn how to listen to other people, but it also helps you to learn in a different way. I think there's a shift sometimes between school, where it's not been personalised and not been this reflective process, to higher education and to lifelong learning and learning in practice, where they've got to reflect a lot more on what it is their experiences are and understand that everybody is different.
Yeah.
And it means it's more inclusive.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, question here.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the name check, Anne. I just wanted to, I'm at one with you in the importance of listening, but I'm just interested in the spaces where we listen. If you could talk a little bit more about the kind of places, the spaces, the tools we use for that exchange and engagement.
So I think sometimes technology, when it's used in those places, there are assumptions associated with it. And I think sometimes we don't get the assumptions right. We don't share those assumptions about different technologies. Especially, I have loads of examples where people who were very engaged with the technology lost their sensitivity to people who were new to it. So at the Open University, we're continually looking, and in the Institute of Education particularly, looking at our understanding, and is that accurate, and is that how new people to it are viewing it. Also people from different backgrounds and different expectations, how are they viewing it? So I think that mapping of understanding is critical. Otherwise you find people who feel excluded, they don't understand the technology, they don't feel, as I mentioned before, they feel powerless. It's like being given a Rolls Royce and only being able to sound the horn.
Thank you very much for that. Anything else in the audience? So we're going to go to the back first, and then we're going to come to the front here.
Hello, thank you for the introduction. Very interesting. But something I bear in mind after I listen to you is how you find a balance. Because sometimes when you listen so much that you don't know where to stop and start reflecting. So I want to know a little bit more of that.
So that's a very interesting question, because you could be continually just changing and reflecting on feedback. I think you need to understand what the goal is, which is why I highlighted about assumptions that we can make about where we're trying to get to. And so the listening needs to be understood as in with regard to personalised learning. How does it feed into that personal reflection on how they're going to achieve their goals? How does it help us as teachers to be able to reflect it? How does it help practitioners do their job better? So I think you need to understand the goals, and then you need to understand what the assumptions are, and then sequentially, so you don't listen to everything, focus in on those things.
Very good. Yes, and down the front here.
Thank you, Anne. That was so stimulating and interesting to listen to. Could I just take you back to your discussion about the work you did in schools on deep learning? I completely and utterly validate the need for deep learning in schools, but while we still have that exam system, how frustrating do you find it as a researcher when you can see the value in that, and yet our exam system really doesn't celebrate that?
Yes, and I know.
Where do we go with that?
Yeah, and I know that teachers feel frustrated by that. Interestingly enough, I think the whole debate about AI and ChatGPT is going to help us all to question our assumptions about intelligence. And I think that's where our exam systems comes from, is that it actually has that memorization and regurgitation. But I think actually if we look at something like AI and ChatGPT as if that can do it, then it's actually not assessing our real intelligence. And we need to, it should be prompting us to really think through, so what is intelligence? And our exam systems really testing that. We should be going back to the exam boards and saying, really, I want to get this ChatGPT to go through your exam, and if it does well, then really, is that intelligent? Is that what we should be teaching our children to do? It's like the policy that I said I developed on between parrots and problem solvers. And really what we need in society is problem solvers, because that can't be replicated by technology, not really.
I just want to go a little bit deeper with that, because it's obviously an issue that you've raised here that the OU's thinking a lot about, and I know it's an issue in schools as well, which is if generative AI has continued that trend, that the old way of learning, I mean, when I did my degree, it was a massive memory test. Yeah. Add in a bit of panic and time pressure, and you sort of came out with a rank order of who could cope with that and who couldn't, and that was your assessment. It wasn't a real assessment, but it sort of did something. So now we end up in a situation where knowing facts is not that valuable because they're accessible quickly. Yeah. Being able to weave facts into a cohesive, which I'm not doing very well at the moment, a cohesive statement, isn't that useful because generative AI can do it. So we're left, as I think you've just said, about sort of the real human aspect of intelligence. Have you got any thoughts on what that means for the OU? Because I think that also then means what it means for the wider society. And particularly, before you answer, how do we scale it? Because that's the big issue. I know how to assess one person if I sit with them. How do I assess thousands of people in that way?
So I think, and I think actually a lot of the OU assessment already does this. It does assess deep understanding rather than that memorization, regurgitation. And there were some universities when we went online because of COVID that took their exam online and found that actually students were getting 100%. And it's because it wasn't assessing whether they understood things, it's just assessed whether they could just memorize and repeat it and find it on Google. So I think that for the OU, we need to be really going through and thinking, is all of our assessment that deep understanding? Almost test bedding it with ChatGPT to say, is that a good piece of assessment or is it not? And then relating our learning to the deep understanding of concepts, those tricky topics that then are just reviewed by the assessment. And also that's continuous learning. So problem solving is a lot of that continuous learning. But it's also about the human aspects of listening, of relating, of understanding, of empathy, of concepts used in practice and what would that mean. So there's a whole wealth of things. I think we've been doing it for quite a while. So we're on the right track. We just need to do a bit more of it.
Right. Very good. We've got a question that's come through and I'll just wait for the mic's just coming.
There are a couple of questions actually, but the first one is from the Carnowek Penguin. Learning and listening from employees, etc., is very important. But how might Professor Adams suggest businesses and institutions work and build with some who may be reluctant to share and not forget them? Do you want me to read that again?
Just the last bit, that businesses who may be...
How might Professor Adams suggest businesses and institutions work and build with some who may be reluctant to share and not forget them?
Right. So that's that negativity to sharing and that fear of sharing and power. I think the thing is that actually what you should start to do is to shift a culture towards, if you're not sharing, then actually you're losing your power. And also valuing people's experiences. So rather than it being something done to people, it's something that they engage with, and we value their diverse experiences. That will help shift the sharing. If they see that they're getting some capital value from the sharing. And I think that's an organisational cultural shift that you need to enable with. I could suggest many methods that if they want to contact me that could help them to do that.
I've got a second one.
Go for the second one, yeah.
Catherine O says, thanks for a very interesting lecture. My question is, when we've done the listening and come up with something we want to communicate, how do we get people to then listen to us?
So that's a really interesting one. I would say rather than it's, like I said, it's two-way. So I would co-create with them the solution so that they're already engaged with it, and co-create the deploying so it relates to their practice so they can see the value of it, and co-create them as advocates for whatever technology you're taking or putting in place. So it's that co-creation place, so they have ownership of it.
Very good. Could you tell us a little bit more about this new fellowship that you've had for a little while now, working with the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology? So what's that opened up for you? Any surprises? What have you enjoyed with it?
I think I've understood a lot more about our parliamentary process, which I thought I understood, about what select committees do, what APGGs do, and different roles in that. But also the different areas of Westminster, from the libraries to Go Science, to the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology, and how they work together to connect into select committees. And that reviewing of decision making and that reflecting on it that I hadn't realised was quite a key part of Parliament. But also shifting, I mean, I wanted to shift the whole identification horizon of topics to citizen engagement and that wider, which was a step too far, but they have moved into the academic and experts and understanding that with the knowledge exchange unit supporting that. So I think there's an opportunity for us to be more engaged as academics and researchers in that process, that decision-making process, to identify those future topics across different discipline areas and feed that back. But it is a shift. The whole of Westminster's in a process of shifting. I won't go further than that.
Very good, thank you. Another online question.
Stephen Garrett asked, do you think there is ever a case for not listening, in quotes, in the right context? I'm thinking here of a quote along the lines of, quote, if we ask people what they want, we'll be doing Swan Lake every year.
So I think this comes back to the question that was earlier on, do we listen to everything? I think we need to focus on what our needs are, or what the organisational needs are, or what different people's needs are, and really identify what the problems and barriers are. So it's not a case of just listening and going, oh yes, everything. So in the professional development work that I did in Africa, we listened to the health workers who were out in the field, the volunteers, and they came back with lots of issues that were problems to them to do with the roads, to feed back to the policymakers. The policymakers said we can't do anything about the roads, but actually misunderstanding is a key thing. So I think it's actually just focusing it and what can we deal with now, and how do we understand that your needs in context.
Eileen.
Great talk, Anne. Thanks so much. So many interesting things. I'm just going to pick on one, though. I remember you wrote a paper called "The User is Not the Enemy." So I want you to reflect a little bit more on what you think good practice could be for us while we're, trying to be safe online, but also what's the sweet spot there, given that cybersecurity concerns have, in the interim, increased so much?
So I think in that context, but in other contexts, it's challenging the assumptions. What are the assumptions, and why are those assumptions in place? Is it to perpetuate the current norm, or is it actually to do something more effectively? In that situation, it is more to perpetuate the current norm, although there's some security experts who get very angry about that, but it is. And actually shifting towards ownership will make it a more effective process, humanizing security, as Ken Fang is saying in America. And I think we need to understand and challenge those assumptions. They might have been right at one point, but the world has moved on, and it will continue to move on. We will continually have these status issues, or I don't understand how to use that technology. Each new generation that comes through and generation of technology will mean that this will continue. So we need to get more savvy at quickly reviewing our assumptions, and are they appropriate now?
Super. Well, it's time for us to bring this inaugural to a close, but we're going to continue with some refreshments downstairs. I think we're also going to have an online opportunity to meet together. So we've got a couple of QR codes. So could you just explain the difference between the two? Are they both? Do we know? Yeah.
If you need a dialing code, then you can scan the bottom one if you're abroad. It will take you
Okay. So for most people, the top code is what you need. You scan on that and it'll take you into the Zoom. If you're abroad or if you've got other problems and you need to dial in, use the bottom code and that will take you onto an online space. We also just take the opportunity to advertise our next inaugural lecture. I don't know, Babette, have we got a slide for the next one? Okay, yeah, that's fine. Okay, well, we will publicise the next inaugurals, but in the normal way. And also, we do feedback from the sessions as well. So you probably will get an email asking for some feedback. So please do fill those in because it helps us keep on improving the events. But the main thing for me to do in closing is to say, Anne, thank you so much. Really stimulating, obviously really central to what we do here at the OU, but also much wider societal impacts, which we can see throughout your career. So can I just ask you to join me in thanking Anne for a wonderful lecture. Thank you very much. Well done. That's great. Very good.